600,000 men marched into Russia. Fewer than 100,000 marched out. For 2 centuries, that single catastrophe has been used to explain the fall of the most powerful man in Europe. But the frozen fields of Russia weren't where Napoleon's empire died. They were only where the world finally saw the body. The story most people know goes like this. Napoleon, the greatest military genius of his age, overreached. He invaded Russia in the summer of 1812 with the largest army Europe had ever assembled, and winter destroyed him. General Frost, as the saying goes, defeated the man no human army could. It's a dramatic image, and it isn't entirely wrong, but it skips 6 years of decay that had already hollowed out Napoleon's empire long before a single French soldier crossed into Russian territory. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back to 1806, to a decision that looked at the time like a masterstroke. After crushing the combined armies of Austria and Russia at Austerlitz and demolishing Prussia at Jena, Napoleon controlled the European continent almost completely. Only one enemy remained standing, and it was one he could never reach. Britain, protected by the Royal Navy, which had annihilated the combined French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar in 1805. Napoleon could not invade an island he could not cross. So he tried something else. He declared economic war. The Continental System, announced in the Berlin Decree of November 1806, banned every nation under French control or influence from trading with Britain. The logic was straightforward on paper. Cut off Britain's export markets, collapse its economy, and force surrender without firing a shot. In practice, it was a policy that required policing an entire continent's coastline, an impossible task, even for Napoleon's army, and it created a problem nobody in Paris fully anticipated. Britain wasn't the only economy that depended on that trade. So did nearly every country Napoleon had conquered. Smuggling exploded almost immediately. Coastal cities that had built their wealth on British trade for generations, from Hamburg to Amsterdam to the ports of Italy, watched their economies collapse under the blockade, while black markets flourished under it. Napoleon's own officials openly participated in smuggling operations they were supposed to be preventing. Coffee, sugar, and textiles, goods entire regional economies depended on, became scarce or absurdly expensive across the continent. The very nations Napoleon claimed to be liberating from British economic domination increasingly resented him more than they had ever resented Britain. This is the detail most documentaries skip entirely. The empire's core economic strategy was, from nearly its first year, quietly failing and generating resentment in exactly the territories Napoleon needed loyal. It was this policy, not military ambition alone, that dragged Napoleon into the conflict historians consider the true beginning of his downfall. 6 full years before Russia, Portugal, a long-time British trading partner, refused to enforce the Continental System. In 1807, Napoleon sent an army through Spain to force Portuguese compliance. What followed was supposed to be a swift, punitive campaign. Instead, it triggered a chain of events that spiraled completely out of control. Napoleon, distrusting his own Spanish allies, forced the Spanish king to abdicate in 1808 and installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. The Spanish population did not accept this quietly. What began as scattered local uprisings became a nationwide guerrilla insurgency fueled by fierce local loyalty, difficult mountainous terrain, and a level of civilian resistance the French army had never encountered anywhere else in Europe. British forces under the future Duke of Wellington landed to support the Spanish and Portuguese resistance, turning the peninsula into a prolonged grinding conflict historians now call the Peninsular War. It lasted 6 years, from 1808 to 1814. Napoleon himself later called it his Spanish ulcer, a wound that never healed and continuously drained blood and treasure from an empire that could not afford either. The numbers here are staggering and rarely discussed. Modern historians estimate the Peninsular War cost France somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 soldiers, along with enormous financial resources, over its full duration. This wasn't a single dramatic battle lost. It was a slow, continuous hemorrhage, a war Napoleon never fully committed to winning outright and never managed to end, fought hundreds of miles from Paris, tying down experienced French troops that would be desperately needed elsewhere within just a few years. By the time Napoleon turned his attention to Russia in 1812, his empire was not the unified, loyal machine popular memory imagines. Consider the composition of the Grande Armée that crossed into Russian territory that summer. Of the roughly 600,000 soldiers, well under half were actually French. The rest were drawn from Napoleon's vassal states and reluctant allies, Poles hoping for independence, Germans conscripted from states Napoleon had reorganized to his liking, Italians, Austrians, and Prussians serving an emperor many privately despised. This wasn't simply a large army. It was a fragile coalition of soldiers with wildly different levels of loyalty, discipline, and motivation, many of whom had no genuine investment in Napoleon's success. The invasion of Russia is remembered as a battle against winter, but the deeper failure began long before the first snowfall. Russian forces under Field Marshal Kutuzov refused to fight the decisive battle Napoleon needed. Instead, they retreated for hundreds of miles, burning crops, villages, and supplies as they withdrew, a scorched earth strategy that meant Napoleon's massive army, already stretched thin by supply lines hundreds of miles long, found almost nothing to sustain itself with as it advanced deeper into Russian territory. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, the city itself was burning, evacuated and stripped of anything useful, a hollow victory that gave him nothing to actually occupy or exploit. He waited 5 weeks for a surrender that never came, and then began the retreat that would become one of history's most catastrophic military disasters, as autumn temperatures collapsed and an already starving, poorly supplied, ethnically fractured army disintegrated under conditions it was never prepared to survive. Most people believe Russia broke Napoleon. What modern historians increasingly argue is that Russia simply exposed a collapse that had already been building for years through economic overreach in the Continental System, a bleeding, unwinnable war in Spain, and an empire held together less by loyalty than by fear and coercion stretched across a continent too vast and too resentful to control indefinitely. The retreat from Moscow destroyed the Grande Armée's manpower, but it did not create the underlying weakness. It revealed it, catastrophically and all at once, to every enemy watching. What followed confirmed exactly how fragile the empire had become. Encouraged by news of the Russian catastrophe, Prussia and Austria, former allies bound to Napoleon by coercion rather than loyalty, switched sides. The War of the Sixth Coalition assembled the largest anti-French alliance Europe had ever seen. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, sometimes called the Battle of Nations, over 500,000 soldiers from across Europe collided in the largest battle the continent had witnessed before the 20th century. Napoleon lost decisively. Paris fell the following spring. He was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814, returned briefly for the campaign that ended at Waterloo in 1815, and was exiled a final time to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. So what actually defeated Napoleon? Not a single battle, and not simply winter. It was a slow accumulation of structural failures, an economic policy that alienated the very allies he needed, a guerrilla war in Spain that bled his army for 6 uninterrupted years, and a multinational force stretched thin across a continent held together by conquest rather than genuine loyalty. Russia in 1812 was the moment all of that finally became visible. The collapse of a system that had already been failing since 1806, not the cause of the failure itself. There is a lesson here that extends well beyond Napoleonic France. Empires built primarily on coercion, rather than shared interest or genuine alliance, tend to look powerful right up until the moment they are tested, and then unravel with startling speed, because the loyalty holding them together was never real to begin with. Historians studying the collapse of Napoleon's empire often point to this exact pattern, that dominance without consent creates a structure that appears unbreakable until a single crisis reveals just how little was actually holding it together. Napoleon didn't lose Europe in the Russian snow. He lost it years earlier. One resentful ally, one smuggled shipment, one unwinnable Spanish battle at a time. The snow simply made sure the whole world finally noticed